Mr. Edelman, thank you very much for your interesting lecture. How to address you was my first question.
Peter.
Peter, all right. Well, Peter, we learned a lot already about the poverty in the United States, but I want to see where we can relate it to our problems in Europe and the Netherlands. And if I'm not correct, please correct me, but I identified 3 main causes for the poverty in the United States, except from the economy downfall and other problems. The first one is the failing welfare system and the lack of active labor market policies in the United States. The second one is low wages. And the third one is the rising level of inequality, as I will put it. And those are the main 3 topics I want to talk with you about. But before that, we discussed a little bit about the politics and the vision of politics in the United States, politicians, I have to say, in the United States on poverty. And I just stumbled upon an interview with Mitt Romney, which is always nice in this context. And he said, somewhere in February, it's not good being poor. Well, thank you. But my campaign is focused on the middle-income Americans.
Yes,
my campaign, I mean, you can choose where to focus. You can focus on the rich. That's not my focus. You can focus on the very poor. That's not my focus. My focus is on the middle-income Americans. I thought, reading this, that well, the politicians in the United States do not aim at the poor people. They are voters anyway, but I think the group is too small. Or can you explain why? Well, the politicians don't seem to have very much interest in the group.
First of all, let me say, I trust you all saw this. The governor amended his remarks recently, or at least he was caught having done so a couple of months ago at a private fundraiser. So he now says he doesn't care about 47% of the American people. Insofar as he might have thought it was useful to demonize the poor or say he doesn't care, he got away with that. But insofar as he upped the number to 47%, he didn't get away with that. And that's rather telling. There is some line there, you know, whether it's 15% of the American people, that's who's poor according to our measure, or whatever it is. You can actually get away if you racialize it by denigrating the poor. In any case, you can get away with not saying anything. And why is that? I mean, even Barack Obama, whom I strongly support, and who did a lot for low-income people as president. I talked about the Recovery Act, but also the addition of 16 million people to our Medicaid program. But he doesn't talk a lot about those accomplishments. So the best I can tell you, I don't like to say it, but it's part of the answer, the difficulty of answering some of those earlier questions, is that overall in our politics, people are not tremendously interested in hearing about poor people. And the only good thing to say in addition with that is that doesn't mean we haven't done anything. I talked about those 40 million people who would be in poverty if we didn't have the public policies that we have.
All right. Well, thank you. One of the problems you identify is that the states have the freedom to spend the money on welfare almost as they please. There are no legal rights you can enforce if you are in poverty. In the Netherlands, we have a debate that the communities or municipalities should have more freedom to spend the money on welfare the way they like or they seem fit. Could you reflect on that, because you are not too positive about the way it is now in the United States?
It depends on how much you trust your local governments, which I suggest you might trust them more than we trust some of our states in the United States.
I think it's the same in the Netherlands. We have some communities, some municipalities we don't trust.
Well, then you should be careful.
We shouldn't trust anyway.
You should be careful, because it's a refrain in our politics that the states know better. And of course, this goes back many, many decades when the southern states said they knew better how to deal with people of color. And so states' rights was the answer to having national civil rights legislation. And that's a stark example of the fact that we needed a national answer. So we've had over the years a number of programs that had been national that were turned into what we call block grants, which basically means the state has a great deal of authority to decide how it will use the federal money. And I think it's fair to say that the one that's been the most troubling, and perhaps not surprisingly because of its connection to race, is welfare, is cash assistance. So if you go to New York or California, places that you think of as reasonably liberal, their programs of TANF are pretty good. And in fact, about 40% of all the welfare recipients that we still have in the United States are in those two states, almost 30% in California alone. But what happens is that you have the Wyoming example that I gave you, Texas, under 10% of the low-income children living in low-income families getting cash assistance. And so it's just blown this huge hole in the safety net. Now, another thing you can do, I don't want to get us down too far into the weeds, but how you design the devolution is very important. If you say, for example, that there is a national minimum payment, you'll have it administered by the units of government at the local level, but there are national requirements and standards about it, and that what you're leaving to them is, let's say, the activities, how they design the activities to help people find a job. On that, you have the local flexibility. That makes more sense. If you just say, have the benefit level anything you want, then I would say, I don't know your local governments well enough, but I'd worry about that.
Okay. Well, I think we are also, but I'm not sure about that. But it's important being poor in California. That's better than in Wyoming. That's,
yeah.
And I think in the Netherlands are too small to make a separation like that, I'm afraid. Yeah. The other thing you mentioned are the low wages, which is, well, intriguing. And one of the causes of low wages, you said, was the diminishing influence of trade unions. And I was a little bit puzzled by that, because we know that when trade unions are diminishing, they cannot afford, cannot really claim wages or increase of wages. Yes. But I noticed, I read somewhere, I thought in your book, that the wages only increased about 7% in the last 40 years, or the minimum wage.
The median wage.
The median wage. Yeah, so that's still
above that, better.
Yeah, and the increase of the other increase is about 80% or something like that. Economic growth is 80%. So there was a real loss in wages.
If you look at the distribution, it's very heavily at the top, 1%, 5%.
But still, trade unions in the past were also not able to claim the decent wages, leveling out.
As you know, the trade unions in the private sector are now 8% of the private sector workforce, and so they've diminished, and we can certainly go into the details of that. And they never did organize the new low-wage workers. And that's, in some cases, we have some unions like the Service Employees International Union, which tries very hard. But among other things, the business lobbies have destroyed the power of our National Labor Relations Board, so that even if they win an election in a bargaining unit, they can't get the employer to bargain with them. They can't enforce the fact that they won the election. So it's really become a sort of a vicious circle.
But it was also so about 40 or 30 years ago. Even in that period, at the end of the 70s, the starting of the 80s, trade unions were not able to compensate for the inflation, for example. So, and then in that time, the trade unions had a higher affiliation rate.
Right.
So even with a higher affiliation rate, trade unions were not able to cope to get the inflation on the wages.
Well, you had in the 70s, in the United States, we had stagflation. We had this peculiar economy where there was actually big inflation and at the same time big unemployment. But it's a long story. One of the things that we think about what happened to unions in the United States is a generational thing. so that you had families that were great union families in Michigan, for example, in the auto plants and the steel plants and so on. And they got to a point where they moved to the suburbs, and either they or their children thought they didn't particularly need the unions anymore. There's a county in Michigan called Macomb County, which was in its demographics very heavily historically Democrat, lots of union members, and they voted for Ronald Reagan in a very large majority. And they were known in the national political commentary as the Reagan Democrats. Oh, yeah. So you have to kind of understand that phenomenon as well. It's not necessarily rational, but it happened.
Well, it happened in Europe, I think, exactly the same way as you said before. You showed us the way a little bit. So I'm afraid we're heading also at an affiliation rate of about 8%, which I think is devastating for, well, negotiations about wages and collective labor bargaining in general. Yeah. So, and have you any idea how to prevent this from happening? Well, you've been there already, so...
Right. Is my Nobel Prize out there?
Well, I can see, I can try, but first you have to give the answer before winning the Nobel Prize.
But I'll tell you first before I tell anybody else.
Okay. Well, and the last thing, the last item I want to discuss...
That's okay, then we go to the...
is the rising level of inequality. I was really amazed by the figures you mentioned, because the inequality level is huge. I mean... and I just sought the figures for the Netherlands as well. And in the Netherlands it's also increasing, but not as much as in the United States. Do we have any explanation for this phenomenon?
Yes, up to a point. One is public policy, I think, is the biggest thing. We've actually decreased the effective tax rates at the top very substantially. And of course, the inequality is bottom going down as well as top going up. And if you're talking about not just the top 1%, but the top 10th of 1%, which has gained even more spectacularly, then you do have a sort of new entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. I mean, you do have some people who you could say came by it legitimately, and you're not trying to make them unrich. You just want them to pay more to help run the country. So there's something of a distinction there. But I think fundamentally, the fact that we let the tax system get away from us is the thing at least we could do something about.
Right.
Okay, thank you. We have about 5 minutes left for some questions or remarks or contribution to the discussion from people here in the room. So who would like to perhaps offer a solution for the problems in the United States?
There's a Nobel Prize at stake. So.
Or draw a lesson for the Netherlands? Anyone who I could give the floor on this? Because else perhaps you have a remaining question. No one at this moment?
Well, I have a question left about the active labor market policies, which are lacking in the United States, you said. The active labor market policies. There are some job plans, but you mentioned that only 2.25 people found a job due to...
that we had a program as part of the Recovery Act and as part of TANF to get public service jobs for women who were on welfare, and it was a number of states. It was an option. A number of states took it up, and it went very well. But I would have, in the recession, done something like our WPA in the Depression, of putting people to work doing things that we needed done, and I wouldn't put them in a private company. I would have had them either on a government payroll or on some kind of an NGO payroll. But our history on job training isn't very good. There's a little bit of a paradox which goes back to the Heckman conversation, because the job training programs that we've had that are sponsored by our Department of Labor tend to be carried out by NGOs. And they are, generally speaking, classroom training. We've gotten better with what's called sector-specific training, which includes some work experience as well as some preparation, and it's geared to jobs in areas where there particularly are jobs. And there are a number of models that are quite good. There's a Wisconsin Regional Training Partnership and a number of them, but they haven't caught on nationally. And so what we regard as an active labor policy is in the hands, whatever it is, of the Department of Labor, which is a tiny little organization. And the real action for all of this is in the Department of Education. But in the Department of Education, what we now call career and technical education is sort of a stepchild. And so that's where the money is in the Department of Education, if we could get it rechanneled to 21st century career and technical education. And then I would call that an active labor policy, even though it was an education policy. I mean, we have career academies in many high schools around the country, hundreds of them, that have been, 2,100, that have been evaluated and clearly make a difference. And they ought to just multiply themselves, and they don't. And we have community colleges, two-year institutions that offer certificates for a shorter amount of time that are very much connected to employers, the same kind of ideas, the sector-specific. But again, when we know what to do, and we just somehow we don't do it all over the country. So we have the potential of doing the right thing in terms of some things that we know that do work, that have been evaluated, and we really don't learn from our own experience.
And have you some suggestions how we in Europe or in the Netherlands could prevent poverty? And well, it's
could prevent poverty?
Yeah, but could prevent, yeah, prevent.
Well, yes. I mean, there basically two things you can do. One of them is every way. I can boil it down to two. It's really 15 or 35.
Perhaps.
But you want to do everything you can to have good jobs. That has to do with your country's whole economic policy and trade and immigration and everything else. And maximum number of good jobs, the appropriate public money in supporting the wage if necessary, the education of young people to come on up and get those jobs, the decent, I broke my rule, the decent safety net, you're not counting, the decent safety net, those are the things that any country needs to have. And includes supports, but this sort of goes without saying in your country, it includes, I think, the things that any decent society does that are supports that have a monetary value. So health care for everybody, child care as needed as support, but really early childhood development, not just so mom or the family can go to work. Help with housing as necessary, help with post-secondary education. All of those things are, among other things, I mean, they're things that any thoughtful society wants to do, but they're also anti-poverty.
There's no one answer possible. It's just a whole area.
You have to stop me before I...
Well, that's not what I intended to do.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much, Peter Edelman and Evert Verhulp.